Everybody. My name is Marcin Krygier. My co-host for this series of lectures is Professor Matylda Włodarczyk, whom you should be seeing on your screens as well. We are very happy. We are very happy to see so many people, old and new friends, joining in. Before we begin, let me just inform you about some technicalities. That is, Professor Hickey has kindly agreed for this lecture to be recorded. So the lecture, but not the discussion after the lecture, will be recorded and posted on our webpage for those of you who could not make it, perhaps, and also for our and your students. If there are any interested parties among them. This is the first in a series of 4 lectures on medieval English multilingualism, which is sponsored by Adam Mickiewicz University as part of the Research Excellence Initiative, which is aimed at increasing the visibility of the university and as far as research is concerned, and also bringing in people from all over the world joining us and sharing in our research interests. We begin today with a talk by Professor Raymond Hickey of University of Duisburg and Essen. And Professor Hickey, I don't know, does not need much of introduction, because if you're into historical linguistics or into varieties of English or into corpus linguistics, his name should be familiar to you. He made considerable contributions to all these 3 fields. Also in March, later in March, we will host Dr. Laura Wright from Cambridge University. And then 2 other lectures will take place in May and June. They will be announced in due course, so that if you learned about this one, I mean, the same channel of information will be also used to distribute information about the other lectures. Because this series of lectures is intended to be kind of overview of the state-of-art research concerning medieval multilingualism, with the focus on English, but not only on English, as you will see perhaps later in the series. Today's lecture is in a way introductory, in the way that it is intended to lay foundations for discussion of the topic. The lecture is going to last for 45-50 minutes, more or less, and then we will have, more or less, and then we will have plenty of time for questions. So if you want to ask our speaker anything concerning English multilingualism, naturally, Professor Hickey will be there to answer your questions. And I think that after this introduction, without further ado, I will pass the virtual floor to Professor Hickey. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcin. These kind words of introduction. And it's nice to see lots of old friends and faces then this afternoon. Sorry, I can't be in Poznan in person. It would be nice to go there, but of course, circumstance at the moment would prohibit that. I should explain very briefly that I put the University of Limerick on Ireland on my first slide. I've been requested to do that by the University of Limerick, where I've been appointed an adjunct professor some time ago. So just in case there's no confusion there, I used to work in the University of Duisburg-Essen, but still do part-time, but I'm also in the University of Limerick in Ireland. So that's the reason for that affiliation given on the first slide. Okay, so as Marcin Krygier was saying, the series is about multilingualism in early English, so from the very beginning of English through to the medieval times and on to the early modern period, I presume. And in that block of time, so to speak, the initial question of contact is between English and Celtic. And I'll come to that in the course of my lecture and give you some thoughts about that, some food for thought, and we can discuss issues later if you have any questions afterwards. But to begin with, I'd like to just talk a little bit about language contact and what linguists assume can be traced to contact, how one analyzes features, structures in a language which may have a source in language contact. Okay, so I hope that the students listening, the Polish students listening, can understand my Irish accent. I'll try to speak it more slowly, but that's the way it is. People have different accents in the Anglophone world, as I'm sure you're aware of, and the Irish accent is just one of many. So now, some preliminary distinctions when looking at language contact. So just remember that language contact is really contact between speakers of different languages. That's very obvious. Contact can be motivated by necessity. For example, filling of lexical gaps, new terms for new phenomena, for example, scientific inventions. The whole digital world is full of borrowings from American English mostly. But it can also be the result of status or prestige. Now, granted, these are difficult concepts, but they have been operative in the history of English. Or language contact effects can be due to a passing fashion, added many borrowings from English, which are not strictly speaking needed by the modern European languages, which have them. And Polish is no exception in this respect. And of course, in the 18th and early 19th century, the influence of French was very great on all European languages after the Enlightenment, the Age of the Enlightenment, and then through the 19th century, including the Slavic languages, I'm sure you know. So fashion can also play a role in language contact. Now, language contact can cause considerable structural change if it is very intense and if it is present for speakers in the first years of life, that is during first language acquisition. So if the language contact situation persists through a generation of children, then first language learners will be affected by this contact, and that yields then different results than when the contact is simply among adults. So we'll come back to that in a little moment as well. Language shift is a special situation which leads to the transfer of speech habits from the source to the target language, usually during unguided adult second language acquisition, and affects syntax and phonology most and morphology least. Now, we have had instances of this in the history of English. We know that the Celtic speakers in Britain shifted to the Germanic dialects taken there by the Germanic settlers in the second half of the first millennium AD. So that point is important about language shift, and I'll come back to it in a moment. So such features can remain, so language shift features can remain in the target language, forming a variety which is seen by later generations as part of their identity. So the mixture of contact features with other features of the target language can form a variety which then serves the purpose of fulfilling language identity for the future community. It's an important point as well too, the actual mixture which arises from the language contact. Now, if you look at sort of standard works on language contact or mentions of language contact in introductory books to the history of English, which I'm sure you know from your studies in Poznan, then they always say the levels most affected are vocabulary, so loanwords and phrases, sounds, present in loanwords, perhaps speech habits, general pronunciation, suprasegmentals, perhaps stress, intonation, then sentence structure, word order, and grammar, inflection, morphology least affected. Now, that is basically true for the type of contact which involves sort of adult speech communities. And that may have been the case in history, of course, we know that. If you look at Polish, for example, there are lots of borrowings from German, for example. Some of them are older borrowings, which you don't really recognize anymore, like Rynek for a town square, which comes from German Ring, which is actually a circular ring, but it's used the word for town square. Then you've got straightforward loans, like Dach for roof. And you've got calques as well too, where a Polish word is taken and conveys the meaning of a German word as a translation, like Ofni for a main station from Hauptbahnhof in German. So you can get loans like that, and they can be quite interesting as well too, in the sense that they affect the structure of the vocabulary of the borrowing languages. But having said that, I will not actually be dealing with vocabulary too much today, because I'm more concerned about the sentence structure and grammar, the influence in that area, because that's the area where language content effects are most pervasive, where they last longest. Well, they last, of course, in vocabulary as well, but they're more pervasive and they infiltrate the structure of the language more on the level of sentence structure and grammar. But there's plenty of vocabulary, and there are things you could say about vocabulary as well too. There are lots of examples from the history of English, of course, which you'll hear about later in the other lectures in this series. Okay. Now, one should also say something about language attitude among the communities in contact. So the caveat at the end of this first screen says that if communities are in prolonged contact with each other, they have negative attitudes towards their respective languages, then the above order may be reversed. That is, when there's a negative attitude between communities, then very often vocabulary is not the area with the largest amount of content effects, but very often sentence structure and grammar, because the vocabulary is an open class, people are aware of vocabulary, and they feel they mightn't want to borrow words from another community they don't perhaps get on too well with. There are plenty of examples of that in history in Europe, certainly. Okay. Now, a word about morphology. The development of inflectional morphology is generally a community internal phenomenon, which takes several centuries to mature. Consider all the morphology in Indo-European languages. And, Polish is certainly a good example for a language with plenty of morphology, as anybody who's looked at Polish would recognize straight away. And the Polish speakers, I'm sure, if they reflect on their own language, can see that as well. Now, with adult language contacts, morphological features are not usually transferred unless they are transparent and productive. However, with child language learners, morphology can be borrowed with ease. Again, you can see that today. I'm sure you know many instances, people in your neighborhood, in your surroundings, who are from outside of Poland, who grew up learning another language, then perhaps another Slavic language, or it could be Lithuanian or whatever, Latvian. And they would not learn Polish then with the competence which a native speaker of Polish would. But the children of these people, the children of migrants to a country, always learn the host language perfectly, because children have the ability to acquire the complete system of a language, including its complex morphology, with ease. So when we come to consider the children in language context situation, everything is possible, and is possible to a full degree, whereas that's not the case with the adults who learn a second language. Okay. Now, sound variation can be used to differentiate quite small areas as opposed to grammatical variation, which tends to be typical of much larger regions. Again, if you think of your own country, Poland, or look at countries like parts of the Anglophone world, there's lots of sound variation, but perhaps not too much in Poland compared to the English-speaking world, but certainly there's a north-south division in sound, but the grammar tends to be more or less the same. So grammar varies less by region than pronunciation does. And the reason is probably that phonetic variation is immediately available for assessment in anyone's speech, whereas grammatical features might not occur in any given stretch of discourse, and so are not suitable for fine differentiation, either spatially or socially. So the moment someone starts speaking, you recognize that person as coming from a certain region. If it's your own language, you could recognize someone from a particular part of your home country simply by their pronunciation of the language. Whereas if there was a grammatical feature which was particularly characteristic, we'd say, of Pomorza, of Pomerania, then if that person didn't produce that feature in a short stretch of speech with you, you wouldn't know that from there, unless the pronunciation betrayed them. So pronunciation is much more an indicator of people's regional origin than grammar would be. And perhaps vocabulary might be also an indicator, but you might have a stretch of discourse where that's not available. So the pronunciation is always available. Okay, now language shift. The idea of language shift, what is meant by this term, is that an original language of a speech community is abandoned, and nearly all the speakers shift to the new language within a fairly well delimited period of time, a few centuries at most. The time factor is important because the rate and intensity of language shift has consequences for the structure of the resulting shift variety. Now, a shift variety is a variety of a language which goes back to a community which moved from another language to this language. And my own case in Irish English is a good example, because the population of Ireland was originally Irish speaking, Celtic language, and we shifted to English in the course of a few centuries. And now the Irish people today speak this shift variety of English, which in its grammar is quite different from standard English. Okay. And here's some contact scenarios for the history of English. Now, I won't deal with all of these. The first one is my focus for today, because you'll hear about the others, I'm sure, in the remaining lectures in this series. But we can recognize some large time periods of language contact. In the Old English period, we've got at least 3 periods. One which there was contact with British Celtic. So the languages, or the language and its varieties, spoken by the inhabitants of England before the Germanic tribes settled there. So before the mid-5th century AD, there were people in England already before, and they were speakers of British Celtic. It's often called Brythonic in Celtic studies. Then you contact with Latin, of course, from the 7th century onwards. Contact with Latin is associated with the Christianization of England, which began from the south in 597 with a man called St. Augustine. It had already begun from the north with Irish and Scottish monks, but the main thrust of the Christianization was from the south. And then there was contact with Scandinavian, of course, from the 9th century onwards. The very end of the 8th century, the 797, then Lindisfarne in the northeast of England was overrun by Scandinavian invaders. And then in the course of the 9th century, so the 800s afterwards, you have then intensive contact with Scandinavians. Now, the nature of the contact is important, of course, because with the Scandinavian contact, we had day-to-day contact between the Scandinavians, the Old Norse invaders, and later on settlers, and the Old English. So people lived, if you like, on the same level, same social level. They had contact with each other, everyday contact, and basically the Scandinavians didn't go home. They stayed in England and were gradually assimilated. But we know from names, everybody in England who has a name and son, like Johnson, Anderson, Stevenson, is of Scandinavian origin, or other names like McLaughlin and Higgins are Scandinavian names. So these people, their ancestors were Scandinavians who became English in the course of time. Now, that type of everyday contact, of course, gave us the results we have in language contact, the everyday words from Old Norse, like sky, skin, skull, all these SK words in English. Middle English is different, of course, because you have a contact between Anglo-Norman, first of all, then Central French. And the Central French contact is more an indirect contact, more a written contact. And that led to, not to the words in English, the old Germanic words being replaced, but by the Romance word coming in and joining the Germanic word, very often with a difference in style, as we see in freedom and liberty, work and labor. I'm sure you've heard these many examples like these from your teachers, your lecturers at the university. So that's a different type of contact, more indirect. And then, of course, you have an early modern English contact from Latin and Greek, which then is manifested in all the creations that you have for scientific terminology or for lexical gaps in English. Like the word sea as a noun, but marine as an adjective, that sort of thing. Horse as a noun, equestrian as the adjective. So coming back then to number 1, British Celtic, that will be our focus for today. But just give you an idea of the spread of contact scenarios which we have in the history of English. Now, some tentative conclusions, again, just to wrap up this first section. Language contact can cause considerable structural change if it is very intense. Language shift is a special situation which leads to the transfer of speech habits from the source to the target language, usually during unguided adult second language acquisition. Such features can remain in the target language, forming a variety which is seen by later generations as part of their identity. Okay, now a few more terms here, which I'll introduce and explain them with some examples so you can follow me. 2 terms to begin with are convergence and divergence. And as the arrows indicate on the slide in front of you, convergence is things come together and divergence is when things go apart. So if languages become more similar to each other, they converge. And if languages become less similar to each other, then they diverge. Okay. Now, there are lots of context scenarios in the Anglophone world. I'm just mentioning this before I actually switch to the history of English, just so you know that the history of English is just one set of scenarios, and similar scenarios are found throughout the Anglophone world. And if you look at the map just for a moment, I only have 2 slides here, 2 or 3, I think that's all I need for this section. If you look at the map, you can see there are areas in dark blue, which are those areas where English is spoken as a first language, and areas in cyan or light blue is where English is spoken as a second language. And in those second language areas like Pakistan, India, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, these places, there are local languages, of course, which are the first languages of the population. And then there's English as the second language. which is used in public and official usage. And there's a lot of interference and transfer from local languages into English, not least on the phonological level. You also, by the way, what you don't have on that map is you have large migrant communities. I think somebody should do an update of this map for migrant communities, because of course people have been moving around certainly since the middle of the 20th century and after the Second World War. In my own country, we now have 4 or 5 times as many native speakers of Polish in Ireland than native speakers of Irish. So there's a very large contingent of Polish speakers in Ireland, as many of you may know from relatives perhaps or friends who went there after the accession in 2004 to the European Union. And of course that produces new contact scenarios as well too, which are of interest and which have been studied recently. So there are the migrant communities as well, which are not reflected in this map, but perhaps I should do an update someday with the migrant communities indicated as well. So that's just in text and the basics, locations in the Anglophone world where there is language contact. Now, I will not go through those. You can look at those yourself if you're interested. And I believe that Professor Krygier will be giving you the presentation I sent him earlier today. So you can look at it yourself for more information. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email or contact Professor Krygier or Professor Włodarczyk or whatever. Right. One piece of literature I would like to mention before I shift the diachronic section, and that is English as a Contact Language, produced by my 2 colleagues in Zurich, Daniel Schreier and Marianne Hunt, on English as a Contact Language, which looks at the contact scenarios throughout the Anglophone world today, not historically, but today. It's a very good collection of chapters on different types of contact throughout the Anglophone world. Very suitable, by the way, if students are doing an assignment like a term essay or something, to consult the chapters there for information. Okay. Now, language contact, the history of English. So first of all, we have a movement, as you know, from the North Sea coast across to England of various Germanic tribes. And of course, what happened was a situation which happened so often in history, that is the Romans left England at the beginning of the 5th century, 409, 410, 411, 12, around that period. And the Celts are on their own, then started fighting amongst each other, as often happens. And a group of Celts then asked for help from the Germanic tribes on the North Sea coast on the continent. And they gladly came over and then decided that they could take over the country for themselves. That's unfortunately something which has been repeated again and again throughout history. But it is the occasion, the historical occasion for the beginning of English in England. Okay. The word English, just to remind ourselves, the students who may not know that, comes from Angeln, and Angeln is a small area on the northeast of Schleswig-Holstein here, over beside the border with Denmark, and the land is called Angel, and the people from Angel with the umlaut or Engle, and that gives you England, which is the land of the Angel, of the Angles, of the Engle, the people from this area, Angel on the continent. That's where we get the word the word England from. The word Brittany, Britannia, sorry, Britain, and also Brittany, by the way, is from Britannia in Latin, which may go back to the word for tin. The word for tin may be in there because tin was mined in Cornwall, Devon and Cornwall, very early on during the pre-English period. And there may be a connection with the word tin then with Britannia, but that's not certain. There are different opinions on that. Okay, so now Celtic Britain is what we had before the Germanic invaders arrived. And the Celts are for the continent, basically. And you can see the map on the left. The light green areas show you places where the Celts were present historically, from Anatolia and Turkey across to Western Spain and Portugal. And they were present in Central Europe as well, too. We know this from onomastic evidence. Onomastic evidence is evidence from names, from places. The term onomastics has the Greek verb onomazo, I name, in it as a stem. So it's the study of names. And we know from place names throughout Europe that the Celts were in different parts of Europe. The word the Celt may well be an umlauted form of cal or gal. An umlaut means that a form changes the vowel in the stem due to a following high vowel. So something like gal can become gel if it is subject to umlaut. Now, if you don't know about that, students, look up umlaut and you can get literature on that. But the point I'm making here is that gal and kel are probably the same root. The Greeks called the Celts Keltoi, But there are names like Galicia in northwestern Spain, and of course Galicia in southeastern Poland and western Ukraine may also go back to this root Gal, Kel, meaning Celt. Okay, so that's where the term Celtic comes from, which we have then for the Celtic peoples in Britain. Now there are lots and lots of names on the map on the right. Don't get upset by all these names, or don't be dismayed by the number of names. These are tribes which have been identified as being in certain parts of the British Isles due to various historians commenting on them, usually Latin historians, Roman historians. But don't worry about that. The point of the map is to show you that the British Isles were occupied by Celts before the Germanic peoples came. There were also some Picts in the north of Scotland. The Picts are not Celts and probably not Indo-European either. And some names in Scotland, Pitlochry, are older Pictish names from the period when the Picts were still around. But they were basically absorbed by the Celts, so that by the time the Germanic tribes come, the early 5th century, towards the middle of the 5th century, the British Isles were basically fully Celtic. Now, the population at the time was roughly around 1 million people. We're not quite sure, these are estimates, but not more than 1 million people, certainly. But that figure will be important, as you'll see in a moment. So this again is the movement across the different groups. There are various subgroups among the Germanic settlers. I won't go into here because it's not relevant for my theme today. But you can look at the map yourself in detail afterwards if you want to. These different groups then are responsible for different linguistic characteristics of the dialects of Old English. But that's not the topic today, so you can look at that yourselves later if you wish. Okay. Now, the Germanic invaders of England came into contact with Celts speakers of Brythonic as of the mid-5th century of the current era. Now, we say the mid-5th century because we don't know exactly when they came. They probably came during the first half of the 5th century, so in the 400s. The first mention we have in history, of course, is in a book by a man called Bede, an ecclesiastical history of the English people, and he gives the figure of 499, the year of 499 when the Germanic invaders came. Now that's probably a bit of fantasy woven in with history, because we know from other sources that the Germanic invaders had already been on the southern shore of England before 449. So we just say then the beginning of the 5th century up towards the middle of the 5th century is when the Germanic speakers came. Now, importantly for our discussion today of language content in a moment, the features is that there was no single battle. It wasn't an invasion. There was no single battle like the Battle of Hastings. At least there is no reference to any battle like that. So it is probably a gradual process of settlement rather than a single invasion one day in the morning of some particular date, like you have with the Battle of Hastings, of course, between William the Conqueror and the English forces in 1066. So a different situation here, but important for our discussion today. Okay, now if you look at onomastic evidence, remember place names, we can see that there are plenty of names in England, in the south of England, which are of Celtic origin, like Kent, the word London, and some river names as well too, like the Ouse. So there are Celtic names around, and of course Cornwall itself, Celtic names around the south of England. So whoever came to England then with the Germanic invaders, different groups, they encountered a country settled by people who were Celts. Now, later historians of an Anglo-Saxonist persuasion favor a purely Germanic lineage for the English and did not entertain the possibility of ethnic or linguistic mixture during the Old English period. Now, in the history of any science, there are always different sort of stances taken by groups of scholars. And in the history of English, in the scholarly work on the history of English, there has been an Anglo-Saxon perspective, which basically says that many of the scholars assumed, without questioning it, that the English derived solely from the Germanic invader, the Germanic settlers came over in the first half of the 6th century, and the Celts played no role whatsoever in this. And this is a type of prescriptivism, a notion of purity for the English race, which doesn't bear close examination at all. So there is this Anglo-Saxonist view, or has been certainly in England, among scholars that the English derive solely from the Germanic invaders of the 5th century, the Germanic settlers of the 5th century. Now, historians nowadays favor what's called the acculturation theory, whereby there was a gradual assimilation of the Celts by the Germanic peoples and no major battles or acts of extermination. The exact quantitative relationship of the Celts to the Germanic settlers is unknown. There's how many invaders or settlers, depending how you want to call them, and how many Celts were already in England. So we don't exactly know. But even the most favorable estimate for the latter, the Germanic settlers, would see them as not representing more than 1/5 of the population, probably considerably less, more like 1/20th or even as little as 1/50th. This means that by the middle of the Old English period, the majority of English speakers were the descendants of shifters from Britannic. So by the middle of the Old English period, 8th, 9th, just before the Vikings came, 7th, 8th, 9th, 7th, 8th century, the majority of people speaking English in the south of England were the descendants of people who originally spoke Celtic and shifted to the Germanic dialects of southern England. Now, if you look at that in terms of a few pie charts, if you take it that the population of the Isle of Britain was not more than 1 million at the time of the Germanic settlement, and if you assume that there were 100,000 Germanic settlers, right? That, or sorry, 100,000 Germanic settlers, that would be 1/10. If you assumed that there was 50,000, then it's even less. If you assume there are 20,000, even less. And if you assume there were 10,000 settlers from the North Sea coast, you know, that's only 1% of the population of Britain at the time. Now, we know from sources that there wasn't a sudden depopulation of the North Sea area of the continent. It isn't as if the Germanic peoples disappeared, that all of them went to England. They didn't. There are one or two remarks, one by Bede, who says that a lot of people came and left their homes on the continent. But what's a lot of people? We don't know. But 100,000 would have been a huge number. And 100,000 would be 1/10 of the British population. And, you know, 100,000 people moving, there would have to be some sort of archaeological record of that number of people moving. Assuming that they could get about 50 people per boat. Now, the figure there, divided by 50, refers to the maximum number of people you could get into a single boat. So if 100,000 people settled in England from the continent, that meant that at 50 people per boat, which is a lot to assume for those days, they would have to have made 2,000 sailings across the North Sea. And there's absolutely no record or mention of that ever happening. Okay, if you go down to the bottom right-hand corner, if 10,000 people came, again with a very generous estimate of 50 people per boat, that gives you 200 crossings. So you can take your pick what you regard as most realistic, but no matter what scenario you choose from the four presented on the screen here, the Germanic speakers are very much a small minority of the population of Britain at the time. Now, this is an example of a Viking longship called the Hugin, which is on display in Ramsgate in Kent in the southeast of England. Now, this is later. This is 3 centuries later after the Germanic tribes came. This is a Scandinavian boat, and the Scandinavians were very good seafarers, as we know from many, many comments and reports. And you could get about 30 to 40 people in that boat at the very max, 30 to 40. So the 50 I mentioned a moment ago was probably far too much to assume for a boat 3 centuries before that. Okay, which would again make the figure of Germanic settlers to Celtic population, even the gap even wider. Okay, now, what about this business of a purely Anglo-Saxon lineage for English? Well, some linguists have produced information. Like I say, there are very few borrowings from Celtic lexical borrowings. That's true, but you don't expect lexical borrowings from a subjugated population. You expect syntactic transfer in the course of time. Now, you can look at evidence from other quarters, and this is genetic evidence. There has been a project called the Oxford Genetic Atlas Project, which has collected and analyzed both matrilinear mitochondrial DNA and patrilinear Y chromosome samples of over 10,000 subjects from all over Britain and Ireland. the results provide strong evidence for the survival of Celtic speaking population in Britain and Ireland, and for the fact that there is no clear delimitation of a genetic group deriving from the Germanic settlers and one for the Celtic population of Britain. So basically the result of this project, here's a website for it, and the main investigator is a man called Brian Sykes, a very famous evolutionary biologist. And there's no evidence, the long and the short of this, there's no evidence for a Celtic segment of the British population and a Germanic segment of the British population kept separate. The two are intermingled completely. You can look at that at your leisure in more detail if you wish. There's a famous book by Brian Sykes, Blood of the Isles, exploring the genetic roots of our tribal history. There's lots of information about the project I was just talking about, if anybody's interested. Okay, there are two other books, Stephen Oppenheimer's The Origin of the British and David Miles, The Tribes of Britain. And again, taking up the same notion of, is Britain as monolithically Germanic as they like to think they are? Sometimes, some sections of the English population, well, it doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, now there's literature on Celtic Britain and on language questions involving the Celtic peoples. So I'll just give you a little bit of literature here, and then we look at linguistic examples to finish off. So these are some books which are widely available on the Celtic history of Britain, and a famous book on the left-hand side, Language History in Early Britain by Kenneth Jackson, is an overview of this period from the Celtic perspective, and the two books on the right are more historical, cultural histories of Celtic Britain just before the Germanic invaders arrived. Also, there's a thing called the Celtic hypothesis in linguistics, and basically it's a reevaluation of a notion which has been around or was around for well over a century, that there was a considerable influence of Celtic on English. And that notion came up then largely through Scandinavian scholars in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, then sort of fell by the wayside and was ignored by later scholars, particularly English scholars. And it's been picked up again, particularly by two Finnish colleagues of mine, Marcin Filppula and Klemola. They looked at the evidence for the Celtic hypothesis and produced sort of modern linguistic analysis of the evidence to see what case can be made for that. And this is a special issue of the Journal of English Language and Linguistics at Cambridge University Press, which I'm sure you have in your library, I have access to, and has several chapters on this Celtic hypothesis issue. Okay, there's some literature references on this topic, by the way. Some more here if you're interested, for those of you who might want to follow this up. This is the handbook of the History of English by Nevalainen and Elizabeth Traugott, and yours truly has got two chapters in there on early English and the Celtic hypothesis and assessing the role of content in the history of English. If any of you are interested, I'm sure you have this book in your library as well too. Okay, now I want to look now at linguistic examples, and Marcin would have another 10 to 15 minutes left. 10 minutes perhaps. Marcin?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
right, that'll be fine.
All the time in the world.
So, okay, so we look at some examples now, first of all. So contact to English history, before the English came to England, of course, there was mixture in the 5th century. Sorry, before the 5th century, with contact between Germanic speakers and other languages in the continent, particularly Latin, excuse me, from the Roman settlers from France and then from parts of Germany. And these words like cheese, street, wine testify to this. So these are the old Latin loans, what's very often called the zero period in English contact, so the period before the settlement of England. So we have that, that's fair enough. Then we have content in the Old English period. That's basically gives you a bit more detail on what I've said already, so I won't go through that again. I won't read it out for you again. The first Celtic contact, then the Christianization, then the Viking invasions. That's just a bit of repetition for you. Now, the contact between the Celts and the Germanics. That's what the Germanic settlers. That's what I'd like to look at from now on. So what do we know about how this contact worked? Well, the first thing to note is that the Old English lived together with the Celts. The Old English word for Celt is welch, and the feminine form is wilch, meaning female slave or servant. Welch is a word, it's one of the what you can call in German a Wanderwort, a wandering word, which is found in lots and lots of places throughout the world. It's found in Cornwall, it's found in the name Wallace, it's found in the name Welsh, it's found in the Wallachia in Romania, that area. So it's one of these words which is found crops up in lots of places. But in Old English is the word for Celt, and the female form wilch is the word for female servant. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the children of both groups would have grown up together, so that the Old English language learners would have been affected during unconscious first language acquisition by the speech of the Celts surrounding them. That way, features of pronunciation and grammar could have been transferred from the substrate Celts to the superstrate Old English. So the English lived together. Now that makes sense, because if you take a country over, you don't banish everybody off up to the mountains as people thought previously. The Germanic settlers banished all the Celts up to the Welsh mountains or to the north of England. Of course they didn't do that. They subjugated them and got them to work for them. And that meant, of course, that the Celts and the Germanic invaders were in constant contact. And with the Celts working for the Germanic settlers, who were their social superiors, there would have been contact in early language acquisition between the Germanic children and the Celtic children. And that is the locus of this contact, this structural contact, which we're positing here today. And perhaps more importantly than the last paragraph in the first slide, on the slide here, perhaps more importantly, large numbers of Celts shifted to English in the period after the conquest, so that, as I said, by the middle of the 7th or 8th century, the majority of speakers of English would have been the descendants of shifters from Celtic. Now we have these linguistic items, lexical items, 1 or 2. There are a couple more, like the word drew from magic, which is related to the Welsh word druids. Not too much there, but don't worry about that. That's not important, the lexical items. So the value of the linguistic evidence is slight because of the social relationship between the Celts and the Germanic settlers. The Germanic settlers were higher. They were the superiors, militarily, socially, the superiors to the Celts. And for that reason, they didn't borrow words from the Celts into their form of Germanic they were speaking, which later became the dialects of Old English. But what about grammatical features? Now, although there are a few loanwords from Celtic, an influence on English pronunciation and grammar may have occurred. Now, one thing is the transfer of consonant weakening from Brittonic to English may have been responsible for the loss of inflectional endings and the typological realignment of English as a SVO language in the following centuries. Now, students, don't be dismayed by that long statement. What it means is as follows. In Brittonic, as in Celtic today, you have a lot of weakening of consonants. So consonants are not pronounced fully, if you like. Stops tend to become fricatives. Fricatives tend to become vocalized. An example from Polish history is the dark L. The dark L at one stage then disappeared completely and became W in Polish. So you got things like wuch, główny we had a moment ago. So the L with the stroke through it, this velar L was lost completely and became W in Polish. That's a case of consonant weakening. That sort of thing happened in Celtic a lot. There's a lot of that in Celtic and Welsh and in Irish. We can see it to this day. And this consonant weakening may have been transferred as a feature of the pronunciation of the language shifters in the Old English period. Now, what would that mean? That would mean that the inflectional endings, all the morphology at the end of words, would have become indistinct. And English then lost these grammatical endings as an indication of grammatical classes and tended to use word order more to indicate grammatical categories rather than grammatical endings. Now, there are languages, Polish, German, Russian, which use grammatical endings on words to indicate grammatical categories. But there are other languages, and they're all SVO languages, which use position in a word and prepositions to indicate grammatical categories. And that development took place in England in the late Old English into the Middle English period, and that may well have been due to this pronunciation feature among the people who shifted from Celtic to Germanic. Right, now the next case is a bit different. This is the rise of the progressive in English. So I'm visiting Poland this month, which I'm not, but if I were, I'm visiting Poland this month. That is the present continuous in English, which does not exist in German, really. There is a sort of one in German, but not really a proper one in German, not as expanded as it is in England, this present continuous. And also the use of a possessive pronoun with so-called inalienable possession. I broke my arm, my tooth is sore. Now, I should say that I broke my arm, my tooth is sore. I have just a moment, please. Yeah, I'll come to that in a moment. That's a type of structure which we have in English where you use the personal pronoun for parts of your body. Now, a bit more information on that next slide but one. Before we do that and give the actual details, a word about substrate and superstrate. I mentioned that the Germanic peoples, the Germanic settlers in the Old English period were on top in society. They were the military leaders, they had conquered the Celts, they were socially superior to them, so they represented the superstrate. And the substrate is the group of Celts, of course, because they were subjugated by the Old English. So we use these two terms, substrate and superstrate, in linguistics. But basically, it's what we've been talking about before, that the superstrate, the group on top, is only influenced perhaps by structure, but not by vocabulary from the group below it, from the substrate. And that is what we'd expect. So it's not something unusual to have few lexical borrowings from Celtic in Old English. We don't expect them given this type of social situation. Now, so I have three features I'll discuss briefly, and that's it. The first one is called the internal possessor construction. Now, what is meant by that? It is a use of a possessive pronoun with parts of the body, with cases of what's called inalienable possession. Now, this is probably the clearest example of contact-induced change in Old English deriving from Celtic. Consider that other Germanic languages do not demand the use of possessive pronouns before parts of the body. So if you want to say in German, my head is sore, you say, mir tut der Kopf weh. So to me, the head hurts, or does the head hurt? And I believe it's the same in Polish as well too. I've got a Polish neighbor, by the way, here, people next door to me, the lady Veronica, she's Polish, so I just checked with her that what I'm saying is correct. So głowa mnie boli would be the same thing in Poland, and głowa, of course, is the head, then boli is then sore, then mnie would be to me, like in Russian, menya, umenya, used for the verb to have in Russian as well too. So my Polish is non-existent really, my Russian is marginally better. So you have the same sort of structure in the Slavic language, that the dative is used for possession of parts of the body and also for the verb to have. So in Russian, something like umenya nowe palto, I've got a new overcoat, would be umenya, so to me is, or to me a new coat. And here in Polish, to me head is sore. But you don't say my head is sore, whereas in English you do. And English is the only language among the Germanic languages, Slavic languages, and Romance languages of all of Europe where this structure is obligatory. You must say in English, my head is sore. You can't say the head is sore to me. Okay, you must say my head, my arm is sore, my tooth is hurting me. So this is called the internal possessor construction. And where do you find it? In all the Celtic languages, but not in other Germanic languages apart from English. And that's clearly a transfer feature from English. And it's the type of transfer feature which would go very easily among language shifters, and then would be picked up by the Germanic children when they're together with the Celtic, originally Celtic-speaking children during first language acquisition. They'd pick this up because it doesn't upset the structure of English, it doesn't cause confusion. It's just a requirement in English that you use the possessive pronoun with the parts of the body. And it says the only language in Europe with the Celtic languages and the other languages where you find this requirement of using the possessive pronoun are the Caucasus, like Lesbian and that, the South Caucasus. So a long way away from England. Okay. Now, you still have a few instances in English in fixed expressions, like he hit him in the face. Now that's a fixed expression, to hit someone in the face. And that's where you still have the him in the face. And in Old English, in the written Old English, the standard written Old English, we still find this type of structure. He hit him in the face. But towards the end of English period and in Old English period and into Middle English, we get then the personal pronoun being used with parts of the body. Okay. Now the next feature, feature 2, there are 3 features, so just bear with me for a few moments. The next feature is identical forms for intensifiers and reflexives. What does that mean? What does that mean? Excuse me. If you look at English today and all the Celtic languages, you find that the reflexive and the intensive have the same form. So the mayor himself held the speech. Okay, and that's an intensive. The mayor himself, so nobody else, not his deputy, the man himself, held the speech, and he cut himself with a razor. So he cut himself with a razor. That's a reflexive, and you have the himself in both cases. That's a typologically unusual feature. So in English, in German and in Dutch, you got sich and sich in Dutch, which is a form used for the reflexive, and the form for the intensive, selbst, is a different form. So it's typologically unusual to have the same form for intensive and inflexives, but the Celtic languages have that. So that will be another instance where we can posit Celtic influence then on Old English. And the form of the progressive, that's not a cast iron case of context-induced change. So we must be careful not to say contact is for everything. That would be overdoing the case. So don't overstate the case when you're looking at contact. There is, of course, a very widespread use of progressive in English and in the Celtic languages. So like she is talking to her neighbor. You would have the same in modern Irish with a continuous form. But there may be other sources for that as well, too. In English and in Latin, which was used in England, English increasingly, of course, with the Christianization. So it could be a case of convergence. Remember, we were talking about convergence and divergence, the arrows at the beginning of the section. So this could be a case of convergence, where there was an innate tendency in English to develop this form, and the Celtic shifters had it anyway. So the two forces converged to establish the progressive fully in English. Here are a few examples, or an example from Old English, where you can see the same thing happening then, which we have then for which we have for Celtic as well too. Sorry, this example is not for the. That's the progressive. This is example 4. Excuse me, I have 4 examples. This is an it cleft, but there are examples of the progressive or a progressive light feature in Old English, like he was on hunting. He was hunting. Literally, he was on hunting. And he was on hunting is very similar to he was hunting. So again, I think the progressive in English is a case of convergence between tendencies within the Germanic dialects and the situation in Celtic at the time. Okay, feature 4, that really is the last one, are it clefts. It clefts are a common feature of modern English and would appear to have their origin in the Old English period if examples like the following one with clefting in a relative clause can be taken as evidence. So here's the example. I'll give you the translation first of all. And then said Johannes to Peter that it was the Saviour who stood on that strand. Taquat Johannes to Peter that hit ware se halend se on tham stranda stort. So it was the Saviour who stood on the strand. Not the Saviour stood on the strand, but it was the Saviour. So this it cleft can be already found in Old English, and it is a prominent feature of Celtic languages and a prominent feature of Celtic languages of English, of varieties of English, which arose in the Celtic lands. For example, in Irish English and Scottish English, in Welsh English as well. So you can get structures like these, or instances like these. It's to Galway, he's gone for the weekend. It's early in the morning, they gets up in the summer. It's out of his mind, the man is, those sort of things. So clefting was present in Old English, that's true, but the range of clefting increased from the Old English period into the Middle English period. And the increase in range may be connected with the influence of Celtic shifters in English who brought their range of it clefting from their Celtic background language into English, and that became established. This wide range of clefting became established in England, in English after the first millennium. Okay. No, I really will skip this because my time is up now. This is just clause final prepositions. This is just an example, by the way. Perhaps I should say very briefly, an example to show that this is not a contact feature. It is true that English has word final prepositions. That's something about I don't know about, and Irish is the same as well too. This example, the following example from Irish, shows you fui at the end of the sentence, which is about, comes at the end of a sentence. But the other Germanic languages have that as well too. You find in German, you find in Swedish. So it's simply a parallel between English and Celtic, but the final position for prepositions is not a transfer from Celtic. So one should be careful not to overstate the case here. Right. That's more or less my conclusion here. The influence of Celtic on early English has, on the one hand, to take into account the demographic situation of the conquest, as the numbers of people who probably coexisted in southern England, the number of Celts and the number of Germanic settlers. On the other hand, the syntactic parallels between Brittonic and later Old English, and to consider these as possible contact phenomena. Not all of them, but some of them. Typological unusualness, as with the isomorphy of reflexive and emphatics, strengthens the case for contact, while internal developments and parallels with further languages rightly demands that one relativizes the transfer through contact and shift, hopefully leading to a more balanced view of the status of these factors in the historically tested changes in the grammar of English. Yeah, so the golden rule in language content is don't overstate your case. Now, anybody who's interested, by the way, there is, I have a website called Studying the History of English, which has the address, which you can see in the top there, and you have it in the presentation, which you'll get from Professor Krygier. You can help yourself to any information there. It's for students or anybody else who wants to look at it, called Studying the History of English. There are two websites. One is called Studying the History of English. The other is called Studying Varieties of English. So there are two websites. The varieties are more modern stuff, late modern, early modern stuff, and the History of English, of course, goes back to the very beginning. Okay. And I'd like to end on a personal note. We're living in very dark times at the moment. And I just want to say that everybody here in the west of Europe is very, very thankful for all the work that the Polish people are doing in this very difficult time. You've taken in hundreds of thousands of people from Ukraine, and that's a great achievement of the Polish people. And we're really very, very thankful for all the work you're doing. And hopefully this disaster in Ukraine will come to a quick end, and the suffering of the people there will come to an end. So thank you very much, you Polish people, for all you've been doing for the Ukrainians there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ray. I hope you can hear me, by the way. All right, because I have problems with my computer today. So thank you very much for your lecture.
The sun is shining. I just turned down the shutter.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your lecture and for your kind words at the end of it. Yes, we live in dark times, well, solidarity remains our main hope in making it to the dawn. So thank you very much. Thank you for the lecture. I mean, it was great in the sense that both specialists and non-specialists could take away something from it. So now we're stopping the recording.